The key was cold in her hand. That was the first thing Helena Farrow noticed when consciousness dragged her back from the dark edges of exhaustion. The sharp, metallic weight of it pressing against her palm, the rough iron biting into the lines of her skin. She had not heard him approach. She had not heard anything except the slow, animal breathing of the horses in their stalls, and the distant moan of wind pushing through the gaps in the livery's old wooden walls. But when she opened her eyes, he was there, crouched down to her level, close enough that she could see the careful, deliberate steadiness in his gray eyes. He was not touching her. He had left 2 feet of air between them, like he understood, instinctively, that a woman found sleeping on straw with a split lip and bruised knuckles did not want to be touched without permission. "That is the key to my house," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, like a man who had learned long ago that shouting accomplished nothing. "There is a lock on the bedroom door, wood stove in the parlor, food in the cold box. You are welcome to stay as long as you need." Helena stared at him. She had been in Orrin Gallagher's town for less than 12 hours, and she had already bled on his livery floor. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw from a night that had gone so catastrophically wrong that she could still taste the dust of the road she had run down. "No," he agreed, and he rose to his full height slowly, making sure she could track every movement. "But I know what it looks like when someone has nowhere else to go." He left her there with the key, and Helena Farrow pressed it against her chest like a benediction, and she thought about all the ways trust had destroyed her before, and she thought about his steady gray eyes, and she decided, against every screaming instinct she had, to trust him. She would spend the next 4 months learning exactly what kind of man Orrin Gallagher was. She would spend those 4 months fighting the particular, terrifying gravity of falling in love with a man she had never once been certain she deserved. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she would have to decide whether the secrets she was still carrying, the dark, ugly ones she had not confessed to anyone, would be the thing that finally destroyed her, or the thing that finally set her free. It had started 6 weeks before that night, in a town called Harrow Bend, 3 days east of the Nevada border. Helena had not gone to Harrow Bend looking for trouble. She had gone because her mother's sister lived there, or had lived there once, and Helena had run out of options in the particular, desperate way that a woman in 1882 ran out of options, quickly and without ceremony, and with no official body in the world positioned to do anything about it. Her husband had been dead for 4 months. She did not grieve him. That was the truth she carried like a stone under her tongue, the one she never spoke aloud because the world did not have language for a woman who stood at her husband's grave and felt nothing except relief so profound it made her knees weak. Thomas Farrow had been charming and handsome, and possessed of a darkness that he had hidden expertly during their 3-month courtship in St. Louis, and revealed, incrementally, over the 2 years of their marriage in the Arizona territory. He had not been a good man. He had been a man who controlled with silence and money, and the particular power that a husband held over a wife in a legal system that did not distinguish between the two. He had not hit her often, but the threat of it had been constant, a wire pulled taut just beneath every interaction, and Helena had learned to walk carefully and speak carefully and exist carefully in the space his moods allowed her. When he died, thrown from his horse during a cattle drive, fracturing his skull on the hard red earth, Helena had stood at the graveside with his business partners and their wives, and she had held her face in the correct expression, and inside she had felt the wire finally go slack. Then she had discovered the debts. Thomas Farrow had not been a successful rancher. He had been a man who was very good at appearing successful, at making the right investments look larger than they were, and the catastrophic losses look like minor setbacks. By the time Helena had access to his papers, by the time his lawyer had sat her down and laid it all out in neat, damning columns, she understood that she owed more money than she could realistically repay in a decade, that the ranch was mortgaged past its value, and that Thomas had borrowed, without her knowledge or consent, from men who were not the forgiving kind. 3 men in particular. Men with names that the lawyer had said carefully, watching her face the whole time, men whose names she was apparently supposed to recognize as a warning. She had sold everything she could sell within 2 weeks. She had packed what fit in a single trunk and a saddlebag. She had bought a horse with the last of the cash money she had, a steady brown mare she named Clover, and she had ridden west because west was the direction where she had no history and no debts, and no one who knew Thomas Farrow's name. She had been wrong about the last part. Harrow Bend had looked like salvation when she rode into it on a Thursday afternoon in September, the air already carrying the first cool edge of autumn. It was a proper town, bigger than some of the settlements she had passed through, with a hotel and a land office and a general store that smelled of coffee and tobacco. Her aunt's house, when she found it, was occupied by a young family who had bought it 2 years prior. Her aunt, they informed her, had moved to San Francisco with her second husband. Helena had stood on the porch of what had been her only destination and understood completely, with the hollow certainty of someone who had used up all their contingency plans, that she was now entirely without a plan. She had taken a room at the hotel. She had taken stock. She had gone to the saloon, not to drink, but because saloons were where information lived, where people talked freely, where a woman who listened carefully could learn what work was available and who needed it done and what the town's particular economy was. That was where she had seen him. The man's name was Denton Marsh, and he was one of the 3 names the lawyer had said carefully. He was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, and he was sitting at the poker table with 2 of his men flanking him, and when he looked up and saw Helena standing near the bar, something moved across his face that was not surprise. He had known she was there. She understood that immediately. He had known she was coming, perhaps, or known she would eventually appear somewhere within his reach, and he had waited. She had walked out of that saloon without running, which had taken a courage she had not known she possessed. She had ridden out of Harrow Bend at 2 in the morning with everything she owned, and a 2-hour head start, and the particular kind of terror that sharpens the mind down to a single, bright point. She had ridden for 3 days. She had slept in fields and under trees, and once in an abandoned sod house that smelled of old smoke. She had eaten the food she had thought to bring until it ran out, and then she had eaten nothing for a day and a half. She had not meant to sleep that deeply. She had meant to rest for an hour. She had not counted on anyone finding her before dawn. She had not counted on Orrin Gallagher. The key fit a modest house on the east side of Caldwell Creek, 3 blocks from the sheriff's office and 2 blocks from the church. It was a simple building, 1-story, clapboard siding painted a white that was beginning to gray at the edges, a covered porch with 2 chairs, a garden plot at the side that had been productive once and was currently resting under the dry grass of autumn. Inside, it was clean in the way that a solitary man keeps things clean, which is to say everything had a place and everything was in it. But there were no particular touches of comfort, no curtains on the windows beyond simple muslin, no rugs on the floor, no flowers even in season. Helena had stood in the parlor at dawn with the key in her hand and looked at the wood stove that Orrin Gallagher had mentioned, and she had lit it because she was cold, and because the action of doing something practical, was the only thing keeping her from sitting down on the floor and crying. She did not cry. She was not sure she could any more. She thought the capacity for it might have been used up somewhere in the last 2 years. She found the food in the cold box, as promised. She found a bar of soap and a cloth and a basin, and she washed the road off her face and her hands. She found a comb on the bureau in the single bedroom, and she stood in front of the small mirror above it and looked at herself for the first time in several days. The woman in the mirror was 26 years old, which felt too young for everything she had accumulated and too old for the things she had lost. Her hair was dark brown and long enough to reach the middle of her back when it was loose, which it currently was, tangled and in need of serious attention. Her eyes were dark blue, the color of deep water, and currently shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep did not fully resolve. The split lip had come from a branch she had ridden through in the dark. The bruised knuckles were from a fall she had taken when Clover had stumbled on a rutted road, and Helena had caught herself too hard. She did not look like someone's wife. She did not look like a widow. She looked like someone in the middle of a story that had not yet decided whether it intended to be a tragedy. "All right," she said to the woman in the mirror. "What now?" It was not quite a question. She slept for 11 hours in Orrin Gallagher's bed, on top of the quilt rather than under it, still half-dressed, with the bedroom door locked and the key he had given her resting on the nightstand where she could see it. When she woke, the sun was past its high point and the house was warm and quiet, and for a moment, just a moment, she did not remember where she was or what she was running from. Then it came back, and she sat up, and she listened. Silence. The creak of the house in the afternoon wind. A bird somewhere outside. Nothing threatening. She smoothed the quilt where she had crumpled it and felt a small, absurd pang of guilt about that. She tidied the room before she left it. Orrin Gallagher was not in the house. He had presumably gone about whatever a sheriff's day entailed. Helena thought about that, about the particular strangeness of being given shelter by the law when she was, by several reasonable interpretations, a woman who had fled from legal financial obligations. She was not a criminal. She had not stolen anything. But the debts Thomas had left were real, and the men who held them were the kind who had ways of making legal and illegal blur together when it suited them. She found paper and a stub of pencil in a drawer in the kitchen. She sat down at the table and wrote a note. It said, "Thank you for your kindness. I am Helena Farrow. I am not a criminal, though I understand I have no way to prove that quickly. I will not stay long enough to impose. I will find work if there is any to be found here, and I will be out of your house within the week." She thought about that last line, then added, "I am grateful beyond what I know how to say for a locked door and a warm stove. I did not know those things could matter so much until I needed them." She folded the note and left it on the kitchen table where he would see it. Then she went out to check on Clover. The livery owner was a man named Bert Yancey, stout and good-natured, who did not ask her why she had been sleeping in his livery, and did ask her whether her horse had been fed and watered. And when she admitted she had not had the money to pay for the mare's board yet, he waved his hand and said she could square it when she had the means and not to worry about it in the meantime. She was not accustomed to that kind of easy generosity. She filed it under the category of things about Caldwell Creek that were surprising her. The town itself was not large. Maybe 400 people, she estimated, walking its 2 main streets in the golden afternoon light. There was a general store, a hotel, a saloon called the Silver Nail, a church, a schoolhouse, a land office, a doctor's office, and the sheriff's office, which was a square-fronted building with a hitching post outside and a sign that said Sheriff. Oh, Gallagher in clean, practical lettering. She stood outside it for a moment, looking at his name in those letters, and thought about the key in her pocket. The door opened before she had decided whether to knock. Orrin Gallagher was taller than she had registered in the dim livery. He was perhaps 30 or 31, lean in the way of men who worked outdoors and did not spend much time thinking about food, with dark hair that needed cutting and those gray eyes that had arrested her at their first meeting. He wore the star on his shirt with the same matter-of-factness that he wore everything else. It was simply a part of the function, not a statement. He looked at her standing on his office steps, and there was no readable calculation in his face, no assessment of her appearance or her circumstances or her potential usefulness. He simply looked at her the way people look at someone they have already made a decision about. "I was hoping you would come by," he said. "I made coffee." It was such a plain, ordinary thing to say that Helena almost laughed. The impulse surprised her. She had not felt like laughing in a long time. "I left you a note," she said, "at the house. I'll read it when I get home." He held the door open wider. "Come in out of the wind." His office was as clean and functional as his house, with a desk and 2 chairs and a rifle mounted on the wall and a door leading to the 2-cell jail at the back, both cells currently empty. There was a small iron stove in the corner with a coffee pot on top of it, and the smell of coffee in the room was the most welcoming thing Helena had encountered in 2 weeks. She sat in the chair across from his desk and accepted the tin cup he offered her and wrapped both hands around it. "Caldwell Creek," she said. "How long have you been sheriff here?" "4 years." He sat behind the desk, not in the posture of authority but in the posture of a man who was comfortable in his chair. "Before that, I was a deputy in Reno. Before that, I was a ranch hand. Before that, I was 17 and too young to be anything in particular." It was more personal information than she had expected him to volunteer, and she recognized it for what it was, an offering, a first step in an exchange, his history for hers. "I came from St. Louis originally," she said. "I was married. My husband died in the spring. He left debts." She met his eyes when she said the next part. "Some of the men he owed money to are not the kind who accept that the estate is settled and move on. I am in the process of putting distance between myself and them." Orrin Gallagher nodded slowly. He did not look surprised, and he did not look like he was constructing a judgment. "You're not obligated to tell me more than that," he said. "I know." She looked down at the coffee. "I wanted you to understand that I'm not a thief and I'm not dishonest. I just needed somewhere safe for a night." "You can stay longer than a night," he said, as simply as if he were discussing the weather. "The house just sits empty when I'm on duty. It's of more use to someone than to no one." "That is—" She stopped. Tried again. "That is an extraordinarily generous thing to offer a stranger." "Maybe." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "But you looked at me like someone who was waiting for the worst to happen, and it didn't happen, and I think you needed to experience that." Helena went very still. She thought about Thomas, and about the wire always pulled taut, and about how she had spent 2 years anticipating the worst and learning to shrink herself to fit the space that left. She thought about Denton Marsh's face in the saloon, that particular quality of recognition that meant she was already a piece on someone else's board. She thought about this man she had known for less than a day, who had offered her a key and a locked door and coffee and no conditions. "You are a dangerous kind of person," she said quietly. He looked genuinely puzzled. "How do you mean?" "You make people want to trust you," she said. "That's dangerous, because trusting people is how I have gotten into the worst situations of my life." Orrin Gallagher considered that seriously, with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to everything. "That's fair," he said. "I don't think trust should be unconditional or given fast. I think it ought to be earned slow and proven under pressure. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm just asking you to have somewhere warm to sleep while you figure out your next step." She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing," he said. "People always want something." "I know," he said. "I'm choosing to be different from that." Helena Farrow sat in his office with her coffee going slowly cold in her hands, and she felt something shift very slightly inside her. Not trust, not yet, but the first possible tentative orientation toward it. She stayed. The first week was practical and careful, and she kept herself at a deliberate distance, not from unfriendliness but from the habit of self-protection. She found work quickly. The general store owner, a widow named Gertrude Aldis, needed help 3 days a week and was willing to pay in both coin and credit toward goods, which suited Helena well enough. The work was straightforward: inventory, stocking shelves, serving customers, and occasionally helping Gertrude with the accounts, which Helena had a talent for, having managed Thomas's books in the years when he had still pretended the partnership of their marriage was real. She ate meals in the house. She kept it tidy, cleaner than she had found it, and she could not help adding small things. She sewed curtains for the parlor windows from cloth she bought with her first wages, a pale blue calico that caught the morning light, and she planted the last of the season's hardy herbs in the neglected garden plot, figuring they might come back in spring even if she was not there to see it. Orrin came home each evening around 6. He cooked simply: beans and bacon, cornbread, occasional salt pork with potatoes, and they shared meals at the kitchen table with the tentative, careful politeness of two people who were aware that the situation was unconventional and were choosing not to make it awkward by acknowledging that too directly. He did not pry. She did not volunteer. But in the way of meals shared daily, information moved between them by a kind of natural osmosis, not the dramatic revelations but the small ones, the texture of a person's daily existence that you could not fake. She learned that he read in the evenings, history and the occasional novel, and that he had strong opinions about the management of the territory's law enforcement that he expressed in letters to the county office that he suspected were largely ignored. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio, that his father had been a blacksmith, that he had come west at 19 with no particular plan, except the conviction that the West was a place where a person could become something other than what they had started as. He learned that she took her coffee with no sugar. He learned that she was quick with numbers and quicker with an argument, and that she was capable of a particular dry wit that emerged unexpectedly and made the corners of his eyes crinkle. He learned that she checked the doors twice before she slept, and that she was afraid of nothing as much as she was afraid of being cornered. At the end of the first week, she came home from the store to find him on the porch in the early dusk, a letter in his hand, and the quality of his stillness was different from his usual calm. "What is it?" she asked, coming up the steps. He handed her the letter without speaking. It was from the county sheriff's office in the next town. It was brief and professional in its language, and what it said, when she had read it twice, was that a man named Denton Marsh had filed a creditor's complaint with the territory court, naming Helena Farrow as a debtor who had absconded without satisfying her late husband's financial obligations, and that the sheriff of Caldwell Creek was being notified as a courtesy, given that Mrs. Farrow was believed to be traveling in the region. She read it a third time. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of that. "He found me faster than I expected," she said. "He had help," Orrin said. He was watching her face with that careful, measuring attention that she had come to recognize. "Someone in the territory court is feeding him information. That's not legal, but it's not uncommon." "What does this mean for me?" she asked. "Legally. The debt complaint is civil, not criminal. I have no legal obligation to report your location or detain you." He paused. But Marsh is the kind of man who prefers to operate outside those distinctions when it suits him. He'll send someone himself eventually. Helena folded the letter carefully and handed it back to him. I should leave, she said. I don't want to bring this to your door. Orrin Gallagher took the letter from her, folded it once more, and set it on the railing of the porch. That is your choice to make, he said. But running doesn't end it, he'll follow. Men like Marsh don't invest in a chase because of the money. They invest in it because losing a chase is a statement about their power. The money could be settled. It's the principle he's pursuing. So what do you suggest? She had not meant it to come out with the edge it did, the old reflexive suspicion of a man telling her what her situation meant and what she ought to do about it. He heard the edge. He did not react to it defensively. I don't suggest anything, he said. I'm telling you what I know about men like Marsh, because I have dealt with several of them in 4 years in this office. What you do with that information is entirely yours to determine. She looked at him for a long moment in the falling dusk. A lamp came on in a window across the street. Somewhere, a dog was barking at nothing. What would you do, she asked, if you were me? I would stay somewhere with a lawman, he said, and I would build a paper case against the legitimacy of the debt claim. I would get a lawyer and I would fight it properly, because a civil court is the one place Marsh can't use muscle without consequence. It was so practical and so clearly correct that she could not find an argument with it. I can't afford a lawyer, she said. There's a man in Carson City who takes cases on contingency when he thinks they have merit. He said it so readily that she realized he had already been thinking about it, already been turning her situation over in his mind the way he presumably turned over every problem that landed in his county. His name is Arthur Klein. He has a reputation for going after fraudulent debt claims specifically. Helena sat down in the other porch chair. The evening was cool and the sky above Caldwell Creek was turning the dark blue of deep water, the first stars beginning to show at the zenith. You've been thinking about this, she said. Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment, and she thought the quiet was not evasion but genuine consideration. Because what you described, a wife who didn't know about her husband's financial activities, who sold everything in good faith and then ran because powerful men came after her. That's not justice, he said. And I find I have a very strong reaction to injustice. It was said with the same understated quality as everything else he said, but she heard it fully. She did not say anything for a long time. The stars kept appearing one by one, like someone lighting lamps in a very large house. All right, she said finally. I'll stay. And I'll write to Mr. Klein. Then she went to work at the store and tried not to think about how many days it would take for a letter to reach Carson City and a reply to return. Orrin came into the store that afternoon, not on official business but apparently wanting salt and a tin of tobacco. And when Gertrude Aldous caught Helena's eye from across the counter and raised an eyebrow with the particular eloquence of a woman who has been watching something develop before the involved parties have noticed it themselves, Helena looked away and began straightening a shelf that did not need straightening. You seem to be settling in, Orrin said at the counter, and she was not sure whether he meant at the store or in the town or in his house with the blue calico curtains she had put up. I find routine useful, she said. It makes everything else more manageable. That's true. He took his purchases and tucked the tobacco into his shirt pocket. There's a church social on Friday evening. Nothing mandatory about it, but it's the main way people here meet each other, and you'll find it easier to build a life in a town where people know your name. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if building a life in Caldwell Creek were a natural and obvious next step, that Helena almost did not register the weight of it. You think I'm staying, she said. I think you're considering it, he said. and I think Caldwell Creek is a decent town to consider." He left, and Gertrude appeared at Helena's elbow with the speed of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Orrin Gallagher has lived in that house alone for 4 years," Gertrude said, without preamble. "He had a sweetheart when he came to Caldwell Creek, a woman from Reno who decided she preferred city life. He hasn't looked at anyone since, and I've watched women try." She paused meaningfully. "He was in here 3 times this week." "He needed supplies," Helena said. "He needed reasons," Gertrude said, and went back to her accounts with the satisfaction of someone who had delivered her verdict and required no response. Helena went to the church social on Friday. She went because Orrin was right that it was practical, and because she needed people in this town to know her as someone real. As Helena Farrow, who worked at Aldis's store and paid her bills and was a known quantity. Not as a stranger of unknown origin who had appeared one morning in the sheriff's house. Orrin was there, in his capacity as the kind of community member a sheriff was expected to be, moving through the hall with the easy sociability of someone who knew everyone and was trusted by them. He introduced her to people, the schoolteacher, a serious young woman named Frances Acaffer who had come to Caldwell Creek from Ohio the previous year, the doctor, a middle-aged man named Silas Webb, the preacher, whose name was Edmund Hale and who had a handshake like a bear and a laugh like one too. She found, to her own surprise, that she was enjoying herself. She had forgotten what that felt like. The simple pleasure of a room full of people who meant her no harm, of conversation that was just conversation, of fiddle music played imperfectly but enthusiastically by 2 men in the corner while a handful of couples danced on the cleared floor. Orrin appeared at her elbow during the second song. "Will you dance?" he asked. "I haven't in years," she said. "Neither have I," he said. "We can be bad at it together." She laughed, and the sound surprised both of them a little, and she let him take her hand and lead her out to the floor. He was not actually bad at it. He was careful and steady, which was more useful than natural talent, and he held her at a perfectly correct distance with a hand at her waist that was firm and completely respectful. And Helena became aware, with a clarity that was both welcome and alarming, that she had not been touched kindly in a very long time. Not just touched, she meant held in consideration. Moved through space with someone else's attention fixed on her comfort rather than their own convenience. She looked up at him while they turned slowly through the second half of the song, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely parse, something between attentiveness and the careful, deliberate suppression of something more than that. "You look like you're thinking hard about something," she said. "I frequently am," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved very slightly. After the social, walking home in the cool night air with the stars overhead and the sound of the fiddle fading behind them, they walked in comfortable silence for most of the 2 blocks. At the porch steps, Helena paused. "Thank you," she said, "for this evening, for the introduction to everyone." "Thank you for coming," he said. "This town is better with more good people in it." She went inside. She stood in the parlor with the lamp low, and the curtains she had made moving very gently in the draft from the old window frame, and she pressed one hand flat against her own sternum and registered the unfamiliar warmth there with a combination of hope and terror. She knew exactly what it was. She was not naive, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to herself. She also knew her history. She knew how badly she had read Thomas Farrow, who had been charming and attentive, and had given her every reason to trust him during their courtship. She knew the particular danger of a man who seemed good. But she also knew, she had watched carefully enough to know, that Orrin Gallagher was not performing goodness. He was not charming in the way that Thomas had been charming, which was the charm of a magician, all misdirection and spectacle. Orrin was simply, consistently, and without apparent effort decent. He was honest. He was the same at the end of a long day as he was at the beginning. He was the same when things were difficult as when they were easy. Those were not traits that could be maintained as a performance indefinitely. She let herself feel the warmth without acting on it and went to bed. The reply from Arthur Klein came 11 days after she sent her letter. It was longer than she expected and encouraging in its precision. Klein had reviewed the summary she sent and believed, based on the structure of the debt claims, that the majority of Marsh's complaint was legally questionable. Specifically, several of the loans Thomas had taken were in Thomas's name alone, predating the marriage, and could not be transferred to Helena's liability under territorial law. Furthermore, the estate settlement had been conducted through a registered attorney, and the documentation was clean. There was a strong argument, Klein wrote, for having the complaint dismissed, and he was willing to take the case on the contingency terms Orrin had described. She read it twice sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and then she set it down and let herself breathe properly for the first time in several weeks. Orrin came through the door 20 minutes later, back from his morning round, and she was still sitting there. He read her expression and stopped in the doorway. "Good news," he said. She slid the letter across the table to him. He read it standing, quickly, and when he looked up there was something in his face that she would have called relief if she had not been uncertain what he had at stake in her situation. "This is strong," he said. "Klein is good. If he says the claim is questionable, he's right." "It's not over," she said. "Marsh will fight it." "He will," Orrin agreed. "But he'll fight it in a courtroom now, not in a back alley. That changes things considerably in your favor." She looked at him across the table. "I need to stay until this is resolved. It could be months." "I know," he said. He set the letter down and sat across from her and looked at her with that direct, uncomplicated attention. "Helena, I meant what I said when I offered you the house. I am not looking for a reason to change that position." The way he said her name was different from how anyone else said it. She was not imagining that. He had a way of saying it that was both careful and particular, as if the word mattered to him. "Why?" she asked. She had asked a version of this before, she knew, but she needed to understand it better now when the stakes were different, when she had been here 3 weeks, and the situation was becoming less about one night's kindness and more about something with weight and duration. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When I was 23, I was working as a ranch hand outside Reno, and a woman I worked with, she was the cook. Her name was Pearl. She got into trouble with a man who was owed money by her late brother. Similar situation to yours, actually. She had nowhere to go and no one who would help her, and the legal system offered her nothing, because she was a woman and her name wasn't on anything. I was too young and too uncertain of my position to do anything about it, and I watched her leave town with nowhere to go, and I don't know what happened to her after that." He stopped. In the quiet, a horse moved in the street outside. "I decided then that if I was ever in a position to be of use to someone in that situation, I would be," he said. "That's all." Helena thought about Pearl, who had been 20 years ago in Reno, and about Orrin Gallagher at 23, too young to act and old enough to know it. She thought about how people became who they were, not in one dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of the things they had witnessed and the decisions they had made in response. "That's not all," she said quietly. "That's a great deal." He met her eyes and held them for a moment, and the air in the kitchen was very still. Then he stood and picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table. "I'll be at the office if you need anything," he said, and he left. and she sat with the letter and the cooling coffee and the knowledge that something between them had moved a little closer to the edge of what it was becoming. October settled over Caldwell Creek like a quilt, the air sharp and clear, and the cottonwoods along the creek going gold against the blue sky. Helena had been there a month. She had paid Bert Yancey for Clover's board and begun paying Orrin a small amount toward the household expenses, which he had initially resisted, and then accepted, when she pointed out that accepting it was the respectful choice, and that she was not a charity case, but a woman paying her way. He had accepted it without further argument, which she appreciated. She had made a friend in Francis Acaffer, the schoolteacher, who was 24 and sharp, and had opinions about everything and a directness that Helena found refreshing. They met for coffee twice a week, and Francis told her about the difficulties of teaching in a frontier school with inadequate supplies and students who needed to work their family's land as much as they needed education. And Helena told her, carefully, in pieces, about the year since Thomas's death, and Francis listened without flinching, and without offering the particular kind of pity that felt like diminishment. "You are not the first woman I've met in this territory who has spent years being slowly erased," Francis said one afternoon in November, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "And you are certainly not the most erased I've encountered. But I'll tell you what I tell the girls in my classroom. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to have opinions and preferences and a life that is arranged according to your own judgment. No one can give you that permission. You have to decide it's yours." Helena thought about that for a long time. She thought it was possibly the most useful thing anyone had said to her in years. She began to take up space, carefully at first, and then less carefully. She rearranged the kitchen to a more functional configuration and told Orrin she had done it, and he said fine. That was a better arrangement. He had been meaning to do that for 2 years. She learned that he had a deadpan sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, that he had a genuine and considered ethical philosophy that he had developed through experience rather than doctrine, and that he was capable of changing his mind when presented with a compelling argument, which was rarer in a man than it should have been. He learned that she had been an excellent student before marriage had contracted her world to the dimensions of Thomas Farrow's priorities, that she had a particular gift for strategic thinking that had been wasted in the management of a household she had not chosen, and that she was funny when she trusted herself enough to be, with a wit that was dry and precise, and hit its mark every time. She caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, not with anything proprietary or calculating, but with the expression of someone who is considering something carefully and has not yet reached a conclusion. She watched him too. She was honest enough with herself to admit that. In mid-November, Denton Marsh sent a man to Caldwell Creek. He was not subtle about it. The man rode in on a bay horse on a Wednesday morning and tied up outside the sheriff's office, which struck Helena, when she heard about it from Gertrude, as either very brazen or very stupid. And then she thought about Marsh and concluded it was brazen. Orrin was in his office when the man walked in. She knew this because she had come to the store that morning and seen the bay horse outside the sheriff's office and had gone in after a moment's consideration, because she was done with running and done with hiding. And if this was her situation, she was going to face it standing up. The man was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who did the kind of work that required him to be unpleasant, and had made peace with that long ago. He had not given Orrin his name, which was interesting. He had instead described himself as a representative of a private financial interest, and had asked about a woman named Helena Farrow, and whether the sheriff had any information about her whereabouts. Orrin was seated at his desk when she walked in. The man was standing, which meant he had not been invited to sit. Both of them looked at her when she entered. She looked at the man steadily. "I am Helena Farrow," she said. "Whatever message you're carrying from Denton Marsh, you can deliver it directly." The man looked at Orrin, then back at her. Something shifted in his calculation, she could see it. He had expected to find her afraid. He had not expected her to walk into the room voluntarily. "Mr. Marsh is willing to negotiate a settlement," the man said. "A payment schedule that takes your current financial situation into account. He is being generous." "Mr. Marsh's complaint has been reviewed by an attorney in Carson City," Helena said, keeping her voice even and professional, the way she had learned to keep her voice when she was most afraid. "Who has determined that the majority of the debt he is claiming is not legally transferable to me under territorial law. We are in the process of filing a formal response with the territory court. Mr. Marsh is welcome to continue his action through legal channels. I would advise him that is how I intend to proceed." The man stared at her. "I'll tell him that," he said finally. "Please do." She moved aside from the door and held it open with the clear implication that the meeting was concluded. He left. She heard his horse move away from the hitching post. She closed the door and stood with her back to it and let out a breath that she had been holding for approximately 3 minutes. Orrin was watching her with an expression that she finally identified. In this moment when she was too shaken to maintain her usual careful cataloging of what she let herself read into his expressions, as unambiguous admiration. "That was well done," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's what made it well done." She laughed, and then to her extreme embarrassment her eyes filled with tears and she looked at the ceiling and blinked until they receded. "I'm sorry," she said. "That happens sometimes after. The fear finds a way out." "There's nothing to apologize for," he said. And he crossed the room and handed her a handkerchief from his pocket with the same direct, uncomplicated practicality that characterized everything he did. And she took it and pressed it against her eyes, and found that the linen smelled faintly of tobacco and clean cotton. She kept the handkerchief. She forgot to give it back that day, and then it seemed awkward to return it later, and eventually she stopped thinking about returning it and just kept it. December came and brought with it the first snow of the season. Not a great deal of it, but enough to frost the ground white in the mornings and put ice on the horse troughs. Helena had been in Caldwell Creek for 2.5 months, and had stopped thinking about it as a temporary arrangement without entirely registering the moment when she stopped. Arthur Klein wrote from Carson City to say that he had filed their formal response, and that the territory court had placed the matter on the docket for the spring term, and that he remained confident in the outcome. Denton Marsh had not been heard from again in Caldwell Creek, which could mean he had accepted the legal process, or could mean he was planning something else, and Orrin checked the situation with the territory marshal's office periodically. Helena was teaching herself to exist with uncertainty, which was different from living in fear. Fear was reactive. It contracted and isolated. Uncertainty was a condition of existence, and you could learn to work within it without letting it shrink your world. She joined the small library society that Francis ran from the schoolhouse on Saturday afternoons, a collection of perhaps 24 volumes that circulated among the town's readers. She helped Gertrude organize the store's Christmas stock. She made friends with the doctor's wife, a warm and talkative woman named Clara Webb, who had lived in Caldwell Creek for 12 years and knew everything about everyone, and shared a surprising amount of it freely. On a Saturday evening in mid-December, the town organized a Christmas gathering at the church hall, a larger and more elaborate version of the Friday socials, with food brought by most of the households and a decorated pine tree that someone had hauled in from the hills. Helena had made 2 apple pies, which were received with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested Caldwell Creek did not have enough people who could make a good apple pie. She was standing near the Christmas tree with a cup of cider when Orrin appeared beside her. He had a cup of his own, and he stood looking at the room with that expression of considered contentment that she had come to recognize, the expression of a man who had built something he valued and knew it. "You look happy," she said, because it was true and because she had reached the point in their acquaintance where she said true things. He turned to look at her. "I am," he said, "happier than I have been in a while, actually." She held his gaze. She was getting better at that, at not looking away when things became direct. "Because of Christmas," she said. "No," he said, simply and without drama, and his gray eyes were the particular warm shade they went sometimes in lamplight. She felt the warmth in her chest that she had stopped trying to argue herself out of, because it had become too constant and too clear to pretend it was something other than what it was. She looked down at her cider. "Orrin," she said. "Helena," he said, "I need to tell you something." She had been thinking about it for weeks, turning it over, determining whether she owed it to him and concluding that she did, not because he had asked for it, but because she had decided to be honest, and honesty meant the uncomfortable things too. "There are parts of my marriage I haven't told you about, not the debt, the other things." He waited, giving her the space to say it. "I was not happy," she said. "Thomas was not." She paused, finding the right words that were true without being dramatic about it. "He was not kind. He was controlling in ways that were not always obvious to the people around us. I spent 2 years learning to be small and quiet and to anticipate his moods. And when he died, the first thing I felt was relief, and then I felt ashamed of the relief, and then I felt ashamed of the shame, and I have not entirely untangled all of it." "You don't need to feel ashamed of the relief," Orrin said. His voice was very even. "You survived something difficult. Relief is a reasonable response to a difficulty ending." "I know that intellectually," she said. "Living it is different, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me." "I told you because—" She stopped. "Because," he said. She looked up at him. "Because I think you deserve honesty from me," she said. "Because I think I am in danger of caring considerably about your opinion of me, and I would rather you know the complicated version of who I am than the cleaner version." Orrin Gallagher set his cider cup down on the nearest table with deliberate care and turned to face her fully, and she could see him making a decision. "Helena," he said, "I have been thinking, since approximately the 3rd day you were in my house, about the fact that this town is better with you in it. And I have been thinking since approximately the 3rd week that my house is considerably better with you in it. And I have been thinking since—" He paused as if he were being precise, "since that Friday social when you laughed for the first time, that I would very much like to be the reason you laugh again." She looked at him. The fiddle players in the corner were starting up a slow tune. The lamplight made the room golden. "That is a very careful way of saying something," she said. "I am a careful person," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know," she said. "That is one of the things about you that terrifies me." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for the terror." "Don't be," she said. "I think it might be the necessary price of something worth having." They stood close together in the warm, noisy hall, and it was not quite a declaration, and it was not quite a beginning, but it was the acknowledgement of something that had been building for months, and that acknowledgement changed the air between them in a way that was permanent. He did not kiss her that night. He was too careful for that, and she was grateful for it. But when they walked home through the cold December dark with their breath making small clouds in the air, their arms brushed once, and neither of them moved away. And for the remaining block, they walked closer than was strictly necessary. January was cold and beautiful, and Helena felt, for the first time in years, that she was inhabiting her own life, that the days belonged to her, that the choices were hers, that the future was something she had a hand in shaping. She and Orrin had moved, by the quiet and unspoken logic of two people who both moved slowly but in the same direction, into something that was unmistakably a courtship. It was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations beyond the one in the church hall. But there were evenings on the porch in the cold with wool blankets and coffee, talking for hours. There were hands held briefly in the kitchen, discovered and then not relinquished. There was a Sunday afternoon when he drove her out in the buggy to the hills north of town, and they sat in the clean winter air and looked at the valley below, and she leaned her head against his shoulder for 15 minutes while they talked about nothing important, and it was one of the finest 15 minutes she could remember. He kissed her for the first time on a January evening when she was washing dishes after dinner. She had said something. She could not later remember what, something wry about the county's administrative incompetence, and he had laughed, the real laugh that was rarer and more valuable than his quiet smile. And when she turned to look at him, he closed the distance between them and kissed her once, briefly, with the same careful attentiveness he brought to everything. She stood with her hands dripping dishwater and looked at him. "I should have asked first," he said. "You should have asked weeks ago," she said, and kissed him back properly, and the dishes sat in the basin for another hour before she returned to them. February brought Arthur Klein's letter with the news that Denton Marsh's legal team had submitted a counterclaim that was, in Klein's estimation, weak but potentially designed to delay the process. The spring hearing date was confirmed. Klein needed her in Carson City for the court date in April. It also brought, unexpectedly, a letter from her aunt in San Francisco. Helena had written to her after settling in Caldwell Creek, because it seemed right to inform her of her whereabouts, and her aunt had written back warmly and at length with the news that she was well and happy in San Francisco and had worried about Helena since hearing, through the family grapevine, something of Thomas's death and circumstances. Her aunt offered money if Helena needed it, and Helena wrote back and said she did not, but that she was grateful for the offer, and for the knowledge that her family had not forgotten her. She read that letter to Orrin over dinner. When she finished, she looked up and found him watching her with such transparent warmth that she had to look down at her plate for a moment. "Family," she said. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have it, even at a distance." "Yes," he said, "I know that feeling." She looked at him. "Your family, your parents. My father died when I was 22, he said. "My mother is in Ohio still. I write to her. She writes back. She has never understood why I came west, and I have never been able to fully explain it, but we have reached a sort of warm peace with the distance." She thought about mothers and distance and the particular kind of love that persisted across geography. "You should see her," she said. "When all of this is settled, you should go to Ohio." He looked at her steadily. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I've been thinking I might like to bring someone with me." The conversation paused. "That is a significant statement," Helena said carefully. "I know," he said. "I made it deliberately." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the February wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the lamp on the table between them cast its warm, steady circle. "One thing at a time," she said finally. "Let me get through April." "Of course," he said, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and that was all he needed to say. March arrived and the snow began retreating from the lower ground, leaving the earth dark and sodden and beginning to smell of the season to come. Helena's life had settled into a shape that felt, for the first time, chosen rather than imposed. She worked at the store and spent time with Francis, and took Clover out for long rides on the weekends when the weather allowed, and sat with Orrin in the evenings in the warm kitchen, or on the porch as the days slowly lengthened. There was a night in early March when a man came to Caldwell Creek in bad shape, injured, barely conscious, draped over his horse, which had followed the main road into town through some instinct of its own. Orrin was there when the horse appeared at midnight, responding to someone banging on the door of the sheriff's office, and Helena, who had heard the noise, went too. The man was a young drifter, maybe 20 years old, with a gunshot wound in his shoulder that had been bleeding for several hours. They got him to the doctor's house, and Silas Webb went to work on him while Helena sat in the waiting room with a lamp and a pot of coffee that Clara Webb made with the ease of someone who had kept these vigils before. Orrin came and sat beside her. He was quiet, the way he was always quiet when something had required quick action, and the action was now done, and there was nothing but waiting. She leaned against him in the chair, his arm around her, and they sat in the small hours of the morning while the doctor worked in the next room. "Do you ever become accustomed to it?" she asked. "The violence, the emergencies?" "No," he said, "but you become competent within them, and the competence is what counts." "The young man is probably going to be all right," she said. Silas had said so before he sent them to the waiting room. "Yes." His arm tightened slightly around her shoulders. "Most of them are." She looked at his profile in the lamplight. He was tired, it was past 1 in the morning, but his face was settled, not tense. He had managed an emergency in the last 2 hours, and he was settled. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out with the ease of something that had been true for so long it had stopped feeling like a confession and had become simply a statement of fact. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had seen from him, something that lived past the careful steadiness, something bright and full and direct. "Helena," he said. "I know," she said. "The timing is peculiar." "The timing is exactly right," he said. "I love you. I have been trying to say that carefully for 3 months. You have been very patient," she said. "I was afraid," he said, "of moving too fast, of frightening you." "You have frightened me," she said, "continuously, but in the way that things that matter are frightening." He kissed her temple, then her cheek, then her mouth gently, and she felt the warmth of it spread through her all the way down to where the fear had lived, and she thought that perhaps this was what healing felt like. Not the absence of the damage, but the presence of something strong enough to hold you steady while the damage became only history. April came, and Helena rode to Carson City with Orrin beside her. He had arranged for his deputy, a steady young man named Marcus Tolliver, to hold things in Caldwell Creek while he was away, and he had not suggested coming. He had simply assumed it with the quiet certainty of a man who intended to be where she was when she needed support. She had let him come. She had learned to let people help her. Carson City was larger than anything she had inhabited in 2 years, noisy and commercial and full of the administrative business of a territorial capital. Arthur Klein was exactly as his letters had suggested. Precise, prepared, and utterly unimpressed by Denton Marsh's legal team, which was larger and more expensively dressed and considerably less organized. The hearing lasted 2 days. Helena testified on the first day, sitting in the witness chair in the territory courtroom and answering Klein's questions in the same clear, numerical language she had used in her letter to him, laying out the financial history of her marriage and the estate settlement with the precision of someone who had managed the numbers herself and knew every figure intimately. Marsh's lawyer attempted to rattle her on cross-examination. He was skilled at it. He used tone and implication, and the strategic suggestion that a wife was inherently responsible for her husband's conduct. Helena answered every question directly and without defensiveness, because Klein had prepared her for this, and because she had spent months rebuilding the part of herself that did not shrink when men spoke to her dismissively. Orrin was in the gallery both days. He sat quietly in the third row, and she could feel him there, the steady, composed weight of his attention, and it helped. The judge's decision came at the end of the second day, and it was largely as Klein had predicted. The majority of the debt claim was dismissed as legally non-transferable. A small portion, one loan that had technically been made jointly, which Klein had identified from the beginning as the weak point, was upheld. But the amount was 1/8 of what Marsh had claimed, and Klein had already arranged a payment schedule that Helena could manage on her current income within 18 months. She walked out of the courthouse into the bright April sunshine of Carson City, with the legal weight that had been sitting on her chest since the previous spring finally, concretely, lifted. Orrin was beside her on the steps. She looked at him. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the street, the wagons and horses and the ordinary daily business of a territorial capital going on around them, and she felt the particular lightness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long they had forgotten what it felt like not to, and who now stands empty-handed in the sun. "I need to cry," she said, with the precision of someone announcing a practical necessity. "All right," he said. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked around the side of the courthouse to a quieter street, and she leaned against the stone wall of the building and cried properly for the first time since Thomas had died, for everything she had lost and everything she had survived, and everything she had found when she had arrived in a livery stable in Caldwell Creek with nowhere else to go. Orrin stood beside her and did not try to stop it or talk her out of it or tell her it was all right. He handed her his handkerchief. He had apparently learned to carry more than one, and he put his arm around her and let her lean on him. When it was finished, she felt completely empty and completely clean. "Better," he said. "Extraordinarily," she said, and she laughed, still wet-eyed, and he laughed too. They had dinner that evening in a restaurant, a real restaurant, with linen tablecloths and actual menu cards, an extravagance that Orrin proposed with the manner of someone who had been waiting for a specific occasion and had decided this was it. They ate well and drank a glass of wine each and talked about ordinary things, because extraordinary things had happened for 2 days and ordinary things were a relief. Over the dessert, which was a chocolate cake that Helena found completely unreasonable in the best possible way, Orrin set down his fork and looked at her. "I would like to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. The restaurant was warm and golden, and she felt, in this moment, as if the world had arranged itself into a configuration that had been unavailable to her for a very long time. The configuration of safety, of sufficiency, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "Ask," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the house or the practical situation, because I love you and I want to build a life with you in Caldwell Creek, or wherever else makes sense, and because you are the person I want to talk to every morning for the rest of my life." She looked at him across the white linen and the remains of the chocolate cake, and thought about the woman she had been a year ago, terrified and running and sleeping in a stranger's livery stable with a split lip and 63 cents to her name. She thought about a cold iron key pressed into her hand in the gray early morning by a man who had crouched to her level and spoken quietly, and left 2 feet of air between them because he understood, without being told. That trust was something that had to be given rather than taken. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." He smiled, the full smile, the one that transformed his careful face into something open and warm and completely unguarded, and reached across the table and took her hand. They were married in June in Caldwell Creek. It was a Saturday, the air already warm with the beginning of summer, the cottonwoods full and green along the creek, and the wildflowers running through the grass at the edges of town. The church was full. Nearly the whole town had come, because Orrin Gallagher had been a fixture of Caldwell Creek for 4 years, and the town had decided, with the particular proprietary affection of small communities, that his happiness was something they had a share in. Frances Acaffer stood with Helena as her witness. Marcus Tolliver stood with Orrin. Edmund Hale performed the ceremony with his bare handshake and his enormous laugh, and when he pronounced them married, he did it with a satisfaction that suggested he had been waiting for this particular ceremony since December. Helena wore a dress she had made herself, ivory muslin with blue embroidery at the collar and cuffs, because she was good with her hands, and because wearing something she had made herself felt right in a way she could not entirely articulate. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Orrin had collected that morning from the field at the edge of town, having ridden out at dawn to find them. He had left them on the kitchen table with a note that said, "For the best decision I have ever made." She had read the note sitting in the kitchen in the early morning light, still in her dressing gown, and she had held it for a long moment before she folded it and put it carefully in her pocket, where it stayed throughout the day. After the ceremony, the celebration spilled out onto the grass in front of the church hall, with food and fiddle music and the comfortable noise of a community that knew how to enjoy itself. Helena danced. She danced with Orrin and with Frances, and with Bert Yancey, who danced surprisingly well for a man of his build, and with Edmund Hale, who danced not at all well but with magnificent enthusiasm. She stood in the late afternoon light with her husband beside her. Her husband, and there was no taut wire in that word now. It was simply a word for a man she loved, and watched Caldwell Creek enjoying itself, and felt the truth of where she was settled fully into her bones. This was home. She had not had one in years. She had one now. They wrote to his mother in Ohio. They wrote to Helena's aunt in San Francisco. The replies came back warm and pleased, his mother's in particular carrying a quality of relief that suggested she had been worrying about Orrin's solitude for some time and was very glad to have it resolved. Summer passed in the particular richness of a life that is genuinely good. The work continued. The days had rhythm, and the evenings were long and warm and spent on the porch or along the creek, or in the kitchen with the window open and the sound of the town winding down for the night. Helena took on the accounts for Gertrude's store officially, at a proper wage, because Gertrude's eyesight was not what it had been and Helena's talent with numbers was too useful to leave as an informal arrangement. She also began keeping records for the sheriff's office, organizing 4 years of imperfectly filed documentation into a system that made sense, which Orrin received with the gratitude of a man who had known his filing was inadequate and had been hoping someone would fix it without requiring him to ask. In August, she knew. She was not entirely certain how to feel about it at first, not because she did not want it, but because it was one more enormous thing in a year that had already contained a great many enormous things. And she sat with the knowledge for 3 days, turning it over, making sure of herself. Then she told him on the porch on a Thursday evening, quietly, without ceremony, because the enormous things between them had always been said quietly. He went very still. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, something beyond the open warmth she had become accustomed to, something that went all the way down. "Are you well?" he asked. How are you feeling?" "I am fine," she said. "I am better than fine." "I am." She searched for the right word. "I am astonished," she said, "in the best way." He reached over and took her hand and held it with a steadiness that was. She had come to understand the primary way he communicated what was deepest in him. And they sat in the August evening with the sound of the creek in the distance and the stars beginning to appear, and it felt like the world was opening rather than closing. Sela's web confirmed what she already knew. November, he estimated by the timing. He had delivered a great many babies in Caldwell Creek and was entirely reassuring about it, telling her what to expect and when, answering her questions directly, treating her as a participant in her own medical situation, which she was quietly grateful for. Orrin built a crib. He was not a naturally skilled carpenter, but he was patient and methodical, and he worked on it in the evenings in the small shed behind the house. And Helena would hear him out there sometimes as she sat reading in the parlor, the careful, measured sound of someone doing something difficult because they had decided it mattered. The crib, when it was finished, was solid and square and entirely adequate. It was not decorative. It was built to last. She looked at it standing in the corner of the bedroom they had rearranged to accommodate it, and then she looked at her husband, who was looking at it with an expression of critical assessment, clearly cataloging its imperfections. "It is perfect," she said. "The corner joint on the left side is not quite." "It is perfect," she repeated. He looked at her and the corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. In September, a letter came from Arthur Klein informing her that the final payment schedule with the court had been confirmed, and that the matter of Farrow versus Marsh was fully resolved. Denton Marsh had apparently decided, after the court's ruling in the spring, that the cost of continued pursuit exceeded the value of the remaining debt and had not been heard from since. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and simply sat. It was finished. All of it. The last thread of Thomas Farrow's shadow over her life was severed and done. She sat with that for a long time, not in grief but in the particular, profound stillness of something finally and completely concluded. Orrin came home from the office and read the letter and put his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head, and they stood in the kitchen for a while with the afternoon light coming through the blue calico curtains. "Free," he said. "Yes," she said. "Completely." Their son was born on the 5th of November, in the spare bedroom, with Sela's Webb attending and Clara Webb assisting, and Orrin waiting in the parlor in a state of contained anxiety that Marcus Tolliver, who had come to keep him company, later described as the most intense 6 hours of still sitting he had ever witnessed. When Silas came to the parlor door and told him he had a healthy son and a wife who was doing very well, Orrin Gallagher stood up and put his hand over his eyes for a moment, and Marcus Tolliver looked at the ceiling. Helena held the baby against her chest in the warm lamplight of the room and felt the particular, staggering weight of him. This new and complete person who had arrived in the world with his father's gray eyes already, apparently, and a serious expression that seemed very appropriate given his parentage. When Orrin came in, he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time with the same steadiness he brought to everything, careful and present and utterly focused. And she loved him so thoroughly in that moment that it felt like a physical force. They named him Samuel. Samuel James Gallagher, after Orrin's father. Caldwell Creek welcomed Samuel the way it welcomed everything that Orrin Gallagher was involved in, with straightforward, proprietary affection. Gertrude made 6 jars of preserves for the household. Francis came every week with practical help and impractical joy. Bert Yancey made a wooden toy horse in his spare time and left it on the porch without explanation. Edmund Hale christened the baby on a cold Sunday in December, in the same church where Helena and Orrin had been married 6 months before, And the whole congregation was there, as they had been for the wedding, because Caldwell Creek had decided this family was its family. Helena stood in the church holding her son with her husband beside her, and looked at the room full of people who knew her name and wished her well. And she thought about the woman who had ridden into this town a year and 2 months ago on a tired horse with nowhere to go and no reason to believe that anything could be different from what it had been. She thought about a cold iron key and gray eyes and 2 feet of deliberate air. She thought about all the ways she had been afraid, and all the ways she had moved through it anyway, and the extraordinary, specific, irreplaceable life that waited on the other side. After the christening, they walked home through the December cold, Samuel bundled against Helena's chest, Orrin's arm around her shoulders. The snow was falling lightly, the first real snow of this winter, and it caught in the lamplight from the houses on either side of the street and made the whole town quiet and luminous. "I was thinking," Helena said, "about writing to my aunt, about whether she might want to visit in the spring." "You should," Orrin said. "We have room." "We will need to convert the spare room," she said. "The one that served as the delivery room is perhaps not ideal for guest accommodations." "No," he agreed, and she heard the quiet laughter in his voice. They reached the house and went inside, and the warmth of it came around them like something known and permanent. Helena settled Samuel into the crib, the solid, perfectly imperfect crib that Orrin had built with patience and determination, and stood watching him sleep in the lamplight for a moment, the way he breathed, the expression of complete, untroubled rest on his small, serious face. She felt Orrin come and stand beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked, very quietly so as not to wake the baby. "I'm thinking about the livery," she said. She felt him smile without looking at him. "The straw was not comfortable," she said. "No," he said. "You crouched down," she said. "So you were at my level." I remember thinking, even then, even that scared and exhausted, I remember thinking that was a deliberate choice, that you did it on purpose. "I did," he said. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that expression that had been there since the beginning, the careful, particular attention of someone who has chosen to see you fully and is not looking away. "Why?" she asked. "Of all the things you might have done." "Because you had been sleeping on a stranger's floor," he said. "And I wanted you to understand, before you made any decision about whether to trust me, that I knew that mattered, that I wasn't going to stand over you when you were already on the ground." She looked at him for a long time in the soft lamp glow of the room while their son slept in his crib, and the snow fell quietly outside. "You are," she said, "the finest person I have ever known." He shook his head slightly, the reflex of a man uncomfortable with that kind of statement. "You are," she said again, firmly, because she had learned that some things needed to be said more than once and received properly. He looked at her, and then he reached out and touched her face with the back of his hand, very gently, and she turned her cheek into it. "Then you have made me want to live up to it," he said. They stood like that for a while, the 3 of them in the quiet room, the winter outside and the warmth inside. And Helena thought about how a life could be remade, not restored to what it was, because what it had been was not worth restoring, but remade into something new and real and genuinely hers, built on honesty and slow trust, and a man who crouched to meet you where you were rather than expecting you to rise to meet him. She thought about the key. She had it still. It was in the small wooden box on the bureau where she kept her few pieces of jewelry, and the note Orrin had left with the wildflowers, and her aunt's address in San Francisco. She had kept it because it was the first thing he had given her, and because it meant something that she did not have adequate words for. Not just safety, not just shelter, but the acknowledgement that she was someone who deserved a locked door and her own terms and the right to decide for herself when and whether to let anyone in. She had let him in. She did not for a single moment regret it. In the spring, she wrote to her aunt, and her aunt came to visit with her husband, a cheerful man named George who was extremely interested in the Nevada Territory's mining prospects, and spent most of his visit asking Orrin detailed questions that Orrin answered with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. Her aunt, who was dark-haired and quick like Helena, and who had worried at a distance for years about her sister's daughter, held Samuel for 2 hours on the first day and declared him the finest child she had ever encountered, which Helena took with appropriate skepticism, but appreciated nonetheless. Her aunt looked at Helena across the dinner table on the third evening of the visit when the men had gone to the porch and the dishes were being done, and she said, "You look like yourself. I don't think I ever saw you look like yourself before." Helena thought about that. "I am not sure I knew what that looked like," she said. "I know," her aunt said. "That's what I mean." The spring term brought another change. Gertrude Aldous, whose eyesight had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer manage the store effectively, offered to sell it to Helena on terms that were remarkably reasonable, explaining that she would rather the store go to someone she trusted to run it properly than to any of the other potential buyers who had inquired. Helena and Orrin sat at the kitchen table with the figures for 3 evenings, working through the arithmetic of it, and concluded that it was possible, and that it made sense, and that Helena running a store she was already managing the accounts for was simply an acknowledgement of an existing reality. She bought the store. She renamed it Faro Gallagher Mercantile, both names together, because it was hers and it was also part of the life she shared, and she saw no reason to separate those things. Gertrude retired to a small house 2 streets over and came in every Tuesday morning to look at the accounts, not because she didn't trust Helena to manage them, but because she liked to, and the numbers kept her mind active, and Helena kept a chair behind the counter specifically for her. Marcus Tolliver, who had been Orrin's deputy for 3 years, was deputized to assist with the additional responsibilities that came with a growing town. Caldwell Creek had expanded to perhaps 600 residents by the following year, bringing more commerce and more complications both. Orrin managed it with the same quiet efficiency, staying one careful step ahead of the problems that arrived with growth, mediating disputes before they became incidents, maintaining the quality of peace that had characterized the town since before Helena had arrived. He was, she had observed across 2 years now, genuinely exceptional at his work. Not in a dramatic or showy way, he would never be the kind of lawman who featured in the dime novels, riding fast and shooting straight and resolving things with spectacular confrontation. He was the kind who listened and remembered and followed through, and was the same person on Tuesday as he had been on Sunday, and that consistency, that reliability, was the foundation on which the safety of the town rested. She told him this one evening directly because she believed in saying the true things. He looked uncomfortable, as he always did with that kind of direct regard, and then he said, "I have better work than I did. I have more to come home to." Which was, she thought, very characteristic of him, to take a compliment and redirect it into a statement of love so practical and specific that it was almost a sentence about logistics. She loved him very much. On a Sunday afternoon in the summer of their 2nd year of marriage, they rode out together, Samuel on a small pony that Orrin led on a line, to the open country north of town. It was the same hills he had driven her to in the buggy that first winter, and she recognized them. The view of the valley from the rise, the way the light moved across the grass, the clean high air. Samuel, who was now old enough to have opinions about most things and to express them at considerable volume, was temporarily transfixed by the view into silence. Helena dismounted and stood at the crest of the rise and looked out at the valley below, at the small, ordered form of Caldwell Creek with its church steeple, and its creek line of cottonwoods, and the roads that led in and out toward the rest of the world. Orrin came to stand beside her. Samuel, apparently satisfied with the view, began demanding to know if there were rabbits, and Orrin told him there might be, and he should look carefully and be quiet about it, which produced a silence of approximately 40 seconds. She slipped her hand into Orrin's. "I came into this valley on that road," she said, indicating the eastern road, the one from Nevada's interior. "I did not know what I was riding toward. I only knew what I was running from." "Yes," he said. "I could not have imagined this," she said, "even if someone had described it. I could not have let myself believe it was available." He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and Samuel found a grasshopper in the grass and announced this fact at great length, and they both looked at their son for a moment, and then back at each other. "I could not have imagined it either," Orrin said. "I had stopped expecting something I wanted. I had decided the life I had was adequate, and that was enough. And now," she said, he squeezed her hand. "Now I understand the difference between adequate and full," he said, "and I find I prefer full." She laughed, and he smiled, the full, open smile she had been collecting since January of the year they met, each one a small treasure. The house with the lock she had never had reason to use after the first morning. The house where she had sewed curtains and built a life and found, in the most unexpected season of her existence, the thing she had not known she was looking for. She looked at it from the road. She still had the key.